Lest ye should be wise in your own conceit, do that you be wise in your own estimation. Well, in my estimation, don't be conceited in your estimation of what you believe. Lest you are self-opinionated, wise in your own conceit, that's what the verse says. Let you be self-opinionated. I don't want you to be self-opinionated what you believe. So that, it means in order that. Okay, you all got your gun. So that, always, how do you get that in? Always pause to ponder in terms of conclusion. Pause to ponder before you proceed to the next verse, or till you draw a conclusion. I was reading a thesis on this subject, and I started on page 1. Now remember, a thesis has as many as 25 pages. It took me, Bill, to get to page 15 before I started agreeing with what he said in the first 15 pages. You follow me? So if I had quit anywhere between page 1 and page 15, I would have never known the conclusion of his thesis, that it finally registered in my mind that I believe exactly what he said. But the first 15 pages, I don't believe that. I don't believe that. I don't agree with that. That's not what I believe. I am not going to believe that. And when I finally got to the end of it, it's exactly what I believe. That's wonderful. And some of us, when we start doing, some of you can, you don't do it, but some people, the first thing that comes out of my mouth, I don't believe it. You don't hear a thing I say the rest of the sermon. Of course, some of you got to hear me first. Those that don't hear me don't agree with me one way or the other. If the problem is that those who hear me has a problem with what I'm saying. If believers today remain uninformed about God's plan for Israel, in the end time, they will become wise in their own estimation, and sadly, this is what has occurred in much of the church over the centuries and to a large extent in our own day. Lest you be wise in your own estimation. Paul is concerned that some Gentile believers and preachers and theologians would be wise in their own estimation and would assume that racial distinction, Jews and Gentiles, no longer exists. Most people today, most preachers and a lot of theologians believe that there is now no distinction between Jews and Gentiles, and that it will always remain the same. And Paul explains that God, several Bible paraphrases bring out it ideally, nicely. One says, this truth will help you understand that you do not know everything. Bill. The truth will help you understand that you do not know everything. By the way, it's the International Children's Bible. Sometimes it takes the Children's Bible to explain it in simple terms so that we can understand it.
That's the New Century Version.
The NIV says that you may not be conceited. And the NLT says, so that you will not feel proud and start bragging. When someone says, this is what I believe, and I don't care what anybody else believes, this is what I believe, I'm saying, I don't believe the thing you're going to say. Because you could be dead wrong. Conceit, estimation, think, have a mindset from meaning wise and prudent and having the capacity to understand, often in the daily things of life, and implies a cautious character. Don't be so conceited in your own mind that you have such a high estimation of your wisdom, because you could be flat out wrong. And that's in everyday life. Conceit describes one who is thoughtful, discreet. It describes the quality of one's thinking, which is the result of insight and stands in opposition to that which means foolish. The idea is that there is understanding combined with wisdom and insight. It implies a cautious, sensible, prudent character, and in Matthew 10:16 refers one who is shrewd as a serpent. One who is shrewd has clever, discerning awareness, accurate perception, and sharp powers of judgment. There is a type that is desirable. Here in Matthew 7:24, and a type that is not desirable, as this is in verse. And so there are two types. Paul's point is that when Christians become conceited, it is because they think they have understanding, but sadly the mystery revealed here, and it's still a mystery things to them. God has a sovereign plan. Put this down somewhere in your mind. God has a sovereign plan. And He has never deviated from it. And He never will. To put Israel aside temporarily in order to show grace to the Gentiles is no basis for conceit on the part of the Gentiles, but it's designed to display further the glory of God. Now remember, God, remember Hosea? Remember the verses we were reading this morning? That He will forever abide with Israel. And He also said that, what did He say? You know, you've got to remember that He's made it so hard. He likes to make it hard for Himself. I mean, He has so hardened or so blinded Israel in their mind that they cannot believe. I mean, He's been way deep in blindness. It's like Elijah. Elijah said, "Put how many barrels of water on this, because I'll see smoke." God has put barrels and barrels of blindness on the Jews, for it seems to us it would be impossible for them ever to be turned around. And God says, I have a plan, and that plan is I'm going to turn it all around. All allured to a remnant, the latter interpretation. So it's saying, I do not want you to be ignorant. Partial. As we said, partial, he says he's saying that all the Jews are partially blinded. Or does it mean that complete blindness applies to part of the Jews? All allures to a remnant are part of this whole nation. That there is a part of the whole nation that is partially blinded. They're all blinded, but some are partially blinded, meaning that we are still to try to win them to Christ. We're not to say, well, the Jews are so blind that they'll never believe, so if I talk to them, we don't know who they are, therefore we are to present the gospel to all Jews. Not all Gentiles are going to be saved. Some are not elected, but we don't know, so we've got to make sure that we get the gospel to the whole world. And Paul has allured to this partial hardening in Romans 9. It is not as though the word has failed, for they are not all Israel who are descended from Israel. Verse 7, chapter 9. Don't forget the truth. only some of the branches were broken off. You remember when God broke the branches off? He didn't break all of them off. Some were still left. Certainly God is saving Jews in our own time, and in fact, He has always had a Jewish remnant of men and women who believe in God, the Messiah, the promised Redeemer. And thus not only was the unbelief partial, but it will also be temporarily, as indicated by the time, until, notice the phrase in verse 25, until, as we have discussed. Notice that Paul himself, a Jew, not believing in Messiah, is evident that the blindness and hardness was only partial. In fact, Paul opens Romans 11 with the truth that God has always preserved a group of believing Jews. And in the same way, then, there has also come to be, at the present time, a group, according to God's gracious, some are still saved. And listen, if God can save a Jew that has been partial blinded, that's a God, isn't it? There's nothing too big for God. Paul doubly emphasizes that this group was in no way based on merit, but on grace. No Jew is ever saved because he's a Jew. A Jew is saved because of God's grace. But if it is by grace, it is no longer the basis of works. Otherwise, grace is no longer grace. Chapter 10. What then? That which Israel is seeking for, it is not obtained, but those who were chosen obtained it, and the rest were hardened. So those in unbelief became hardened. And we've always said, you keep in unbelief, and you will be so hardened, you'll never want to hear the gospel. And most of you have said to somebody, they're so hardened in their spirit, they're so hard against Jesus Christ, they are never going to be saved. And then we say of some people, they're so, they're a little ways, partially they kind of believe this. So they can be partial, or fully, or temporarily. All of us are temporarily hardened by our nature of believing. It could be temporarily. Those who are elect are going to come to Christ. You mark it down, those who God has hardened, and those who have hardened our spirit by unbelief, they can return because God has the ability, because He's God. And Paul's point is that when Christians become conceit, it is because they think they have understanding, but sadly this mystery has not been revealed to them. And so we see that Paul is returning to the subject with which he has begun in Romans 11 to explain how God would work out His plan.